Or she would
When Julie was trying to exam and she was like, can you have a tissue?
like I had like handed to her like
I didn't know that because
yeah, you were nice.
Man, Chelsea,
What?
I like talking to you on the phone in person.
Yeah,
Far less.
most people do.
Far less now.
That's hardly a compliment.
Very sassy.
What's your, what's Kevin's last name? I had a patient who's an MP over there.
Oh, really?
Well, 3 years ago, he was really good. Asking, Kevin, you look tiny, I don't know if I can be an officer.
Just celebrating.
I didn't know how else to describe him.
What's his last name?
A patient? I can't remember his first name. Terrence,
I would know him.
yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, contact with that. I don't remember his name.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Summary.
I have not.
I think we should add more to
Yeah.
I know. It's very early.
Oh, I was gonna tell you, I think on tab, oh yeah?
Yeah.
Under the p-value, you wanted t.this.rt. And I want to confirm it for use, but I did t.this.2t and not to do the same thing. Okay.
It's supposed to be two.
User experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. No, I think I sent it to you before, and then I went back for it.
Okay.
I'm supposed to ask a question for Vince because he won't be there. Do you remember it? Yeah, good. Let me know about regression p-value and if it's just the f-significance value from the anal section. So when they're asking for p-value in a question that has multiple variables, is there a p-value for the whole regression?
As chair. So say this regression was multiple variables, not just one variable. The p-value for the whole regression is here.
Oh, yeah.
But since it's a one variable regression,
Oh,
it's going to be
the same.
equivalent to that.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so if there's multiple variables, you just use this
And it
significance.
depends on the, I thought it was on that spreadsheet.
Can they not ask that question?
And if you're only a multiple variable regression, your significance should be less than the critical value for the most
What
part.
is that our p-value?
No. And they ask you about p-value for the full regression or what?
Yes.
For the full regression, it's going to be significant accurate.
Okay.
How you guys take it out?
the templates.
No, template.
Oh, really?
Oh, no, those were, yeah.
What do you mean, no templates? No idea what that means. But it doesn't-
The
All the
template
things-
questions. Template question.
Where we have to read the question and decide which template to use to answer the question. And that's it.
Where? So, does that mean that he's giving you data and you're going to do tests out of Excel?
Yeah, t-tests is on
And
that.
templates are way easier. I would all about templates.
And it sounds like he wants to do a bunch of those ANOVAs and filling them up.
Mhm.
So you don't know what's on the test?
Me, no.
Like you didn't get a copy?
Work it, girl.
That's the email I sent you.
T-tests, no, but.
Just to go through the- Similar.
This is good. Sweet fun.
Is
It's
it?
pretty good.
Yeah.
You guys all passed, right? Everyone passed econ class, right? There's less of you. The one lady works at Boyd where I used to work now.
Yeah, well, my passed. She was fine. She just kept.
Well, you work at Boyd now?
No, I don't work at Boyd. I work at
Okay.
Boyd. But she must have like accepted that job right as I was leaving. So that's good.
What did you do at Boyd?
I worked in marketing.
Really?
First I worked in procurement, and then I worked in marketing analytics after I moved out of procurement.
What do you do now?
Now I work for a credit card company. I'm like a risk analyst for secondary products. So what I'm supposed to be doing is monitoring our portfolio and seeing who we should give a credit line increase to, and who we shouldn't, and who we should target with different products. But what I do a lot of like, it's near the end of the year, so we're planning for next year. So I'm doing a lot of like ad hoc analysis and lots of stuff.
Do you like it?
That's pretty cool. Pays me pretty well. Pays me more money than Boyd is paying me, so that's why I'm there.
Yeah, casinos don't pay very good, usually.
Go on, Roland.
Oh, it's a huge
So did she quit because of her job change? Or?
Yeah, she wanted, well, she had a job and her boss was not very supportive and he basically said, I'm firing you. So she had to find another job, thinking that the new job would accommodate the schedule. But the new job did not either, so.
And she wasn't willing to wait to find a job that would.
Well, sometimes.
So she seems pretty happy.
And then you picked her up.
The way?
And then you picked her up.
That felt like the stuff in the back.
We know you didn't.
This guy or what?
Darn near.
No, I asked her to review the crest. We have a crest as a cohort. And then she found out through GroupMe that we were the picture, like we were going to take new pictures as a group. And then she responded to me, I'm not doing this, like I cannot believe that you guys are so insensitive and they're replacing me from the group and taking a new picture without me. So
That doesn't seem right either, 'cause
I would not respond to
that was big.
so that was it.
I
Yeah,
think
she went up.
weddings this
Pretty good.
weekend.
So then I go to
We're all
the
just weekend long.
Are you still ready?
Well, no, I drank a little bit on Saturday because I was with my friends. But on Sunday, my girlfriend is in a bridal party. So we get up on Sunday morning to drive to Phoenix.
Oh
Go to
no.
that would have been a shit show.
Oh.
I didn't drink it, so I was just mostly drunk. I was going to really down.
I don't believe it. You're taking me so
Oh, that says it's staff.
Yeah, it's staff.
I've only done 4.
Me too.
Okay.
Okay, me too.
Do you have Dunkin' Donuts drinks for yourself?
What?
Exclusive for yourself?
It's not Dunkin' Donuts, it's Dutch Bros, and this was given to me as a gift from them. This is what I intended to purchase.
You drank so much from them.
I don't know, they were like, "Do you want this?" And I said, "Yes," and I don't know what it is, but it's delicious. So I'm gonna drink it.
Oh, that's good.
Delicious.
With some raspberry. This is delicious. It's flaxseed with raspberry and of the bread. I don't even know. That I like. There's one.
It's really not me.
Where is the guy?
There's one over here. Yeah. Like you did have a nice. It's not even right. You're ready to get it. Party style.
Okay, so
then-
fine.
Yeah, using my chef's. Yeah, we have other things to do. Try and get it.
Yeah.
I know, he's like pressuring me. Is that
Oh, yeah. This is the one.
So you have to run each one.
Right.
So what's the data?
It is the.
Oh, my card. Hey, partner. Good, how are you?
Is that our first page?
Standard.
You did? I said, yeah, just a draft, and then, I did an outline to see if there's any other things you should add in. And then after you click, and I can move.
Yeah, I know.
It's easier for me if I on.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's good. Thank you.
Six thirty? 3 minutes.
Close enough.
How's everyone doing the midterm? Did you grades back yet, or
Mhm.
Yes,
You did miss that.
how do you mess up? Did you mess up the one that we talked about? I emailed about it.
Somebody talked to you about it.
Did you fix it, or?
We both have an
No, you just
issue.
gave me credit if you went on to.
Was your consistent?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fine. The way I turned one in where the pivot table was supposed to be inserted, and for some reason on his, it didn't show up, even though the space was there.
That's probably not, yeah, that's probably like Excel. Oh, you know, Mac, it's probably Mac's fault.
At least that was my,
Never buy Macs, just buy like 3 PCs for the one Mac.
you buy 3 of them every year.
It's all right.
Get a new one.
That's what the people who are like gonna buy like iPads. I'm like, well, no, just buy like 8 Kindle Fires. You can just literally break them as soon as the battery dies. Effectively, it's the same product.
Yeah, we still buy that.
So I was at a wedding where a guy, after the ceremony, this is post-ceremony, pre-reception, security came up to him and asked him if he was doing okay. And he said, "What do you mean?" And they said, we've heard multiple concerns from our staff about your alcohol intake." No, it's not me. It was over. I was watching this kid get smashed. And that was post-ceremony, pre-reception. Which means he had to show up early and just keep going to the bar.
It's happened to me sometimes.
Like which wedding?
Yeah, and then I bet you.
Which one?
This year.
They're both yours. Both my letters.
Did you mean a unit increase in variable X or variable Y? It's kind of like
It's X.
X. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, let's begin. Okay, quick review before we get into things. This is kind of the hardest thing for a lot of people, is interpreting what we're actually looking at once we run a regression. Because most of what we're going to cover in the next two homework is going to be simple linear regression and then multiple regression. So we have this equation. I put up there for multiple. We'll start with simple, but the idea is that we are estimating, we're trying to predict some variable y. And we're trying to predict some variable y as it moves in accordance with some variables x. So there's a correlation between x and these x's and y, and we're trying to measure as y changes with these x variable changes, can we see if x variables are having some sort of positive or negative relationship on the y variable. So when we get our betas, which is the measure, is that point estimate of the effect of x on y, the way we interpret a beta value is a unit increase in the variable x causes a beta change in the variable y, on average, holding all else equal.
Can you say it one more time?
So a unit increase in variable x, so a single unit increase in variable x, causes a beta change. So if this is x1, this is going to be beta 1, causes a beta 1 change in the variable y, on average, all else equal. So that's how we're going to interpret these. So if we think about if y is income, and x1 is years of experience, and beta 1 is equal to $3,000. So for this regression, we'd say a 1 year increase in experience causes a $3,000 increase in income, on average, holding all else equal. So whenever we're asked to interpret a variable, this is the proper way to do so. If the variable is statistically significant when it's okay, so homework 4, tab A. A sales manager collected the following data on annual sales for new customers and the numbers of years of experience, new customer accounts, the number of years of experience of a sales rep for a 10-person sample. Develop a scatter plot using these two scatter diagram of these data with the years of experience as the independent variable. So in the question that we all had like debate on, or I had a debate on with him, it was just because he like summarized. Because he summarized the question and like didn't fully write out the question. I was like, oh.
That happens a lot.
Here we go. So, scatter plot. He wants us to use years is independent. Yep, so that's what we have. Independent variable is x, dependent variable is y. That's some other nomenclature we might want to memorize here. This is going to be your dependent variable. And this is going to be an independent variable. Why? Because we're assuming we're predicting y, and y is dependent on these measurable x variables. We're kind of assuming a causal relationship between x and y. So there's our scatter plot. 2 says, using the charting tool, include trend lines on the chart. If you have a nice fancy version of Excel, there'll be a little pop-up here where you can add in a chart. If not, you can go to layout, trend line, linear trend line. I'm going to shoot a linear trend line in there for you. And it says use the estimated regression equation to predict the annual sales for a person with 9 years experience. We can do this a few ways. The first thing we can do is we can go to our layout. We can go more trend line options. We can say display equation on the chart. So this is going to give us our regression equation on the chart for a linear line. Or we could go to data, data analysis, go down to regression. Our Y inputs, we're predicting sales, and we're predicting sales using the number of years experience. We include the labels, output range, we'll put here. So, here our intercept is 80 and our coefficient is 4, which is the exact same thing that putting the linear trend line equation gave us. Any questions? Yep. Yep. So you can plug in here. So this one, what he says is estimate the regression equation, use the regression equation. A salesperson has 9 years of experience. So a salesperson had 9 years of experience. We would plug in 9 for the X variable. And so it'd be 4 times 9 would be 36 plus 80. So the sales value would be 116.
So I got a different Y. I got 8.8091 X plus 45. What is that?
So click on your data, click on your chart,
Or the chart.
and then go to
Design? New
no,
format?
design. Select data.
Sales?
You put this thing in years, so
Yes.
I would start over and not highlight years.
The years is supposed to be, experience. Years of
No, so
experience.
you just want to highlight the data, and you can't highlight the labels here.
Oh, okay.
So actually go here, go to sales, click edit, and click on sales. No, click this.
Edit.
Edit.
And take one out.
One sec. Wait. So Y and 5. Yeah, you want to move both these from 5 to 6. Nope, that's not going to work. Just click.
Click there.
Yeah.
And select without the label.
Yep, and then change this 5 right here, this one to a 6.
Thank you. Uh-huh. Yay.
Okay. So, tab B. Portion of regression output is provided below. Use formulas to complete the gray shaded areas from the ANOVA table. So if we go to page, what page is it? 4 something? 5 something?
I put 665.
665? That might be it. It is on a lot of pages, so just shout one out to me. It's not on 665.
I might have marked it again.
577. There we go. 577. So on 577, we're given our sum of squares is given to us, and so is our degrees of freedom. So our mean squares is going to be equal to our sum of squares for regression divided by degrees of freedom for the regression. Sum of squares divided by degrees of freedom. Our F value is sum of squares for regression divided by sum of squares for the regression divided by, mean of squares for the regression divided by mean of squares for residuals. Our significance S was F.
Now, is it always gonna be residual? Or can it be labeled differently in other scenarios?
It can, so there's gonna be a top one and a bottom one. So one's gonna be treatment in air, one's gonna be regression residual. Just know there's two lines.
I was just used to seeing treatment in air, so when I saw this, I guess that's the same thing.
There might be another chart for regression specifically.
And she says where it says monkey and elephant.
Is that okay? Same thing.
Same thing, right?
Sure. Don't quote me on that one. Okay.
This treatment and, to multiple, is there something when you go to multiple regression?
No, it's still be regression residual usually in your outputs, I believe. It's like, yeah, we said an output. Yeah, your outputs for regression are always gonna say regression residual. Treatment in air is related more to an actual ANOVA test of means. But we're doing something slightly different here. We're no longer doing an ANOVA test of means, we're doing an F test on the regression variables. So it is F dot distribution, right tail, degrees of freedom 1, degrees of freedom 2. And your significance F should look like that. So F dot distribution right tail. And then you select your F value first, and then your first degrees of freedom, which is the first top row, second degrees of freedom, which is the second row. So the second table here, we're actually looking at output results from a regression. So our T statistic is going to be equal to our coefficient divided by our standard error. Coefficient divided by standard error. The p-value is going to be distribution two-tail x and
Residual.
the residual.
Somebody told me that. I don't know if it's right though.
Well, first we'll do it. Well, here's what we do. We'll go here and check it. So p-value is here. Format date down here. I'm going to say is equal to
Probably have to do that.
T-dot distribution two-tail.
How did you get your regression output? There was no data to do this stuff.
No, I'm looking at the first tab.
Different one, just-
Look at a different tab just to proof of concept.
Perfect.
Residual. There we go. Residual's it.
So what are those degrees of freedom signifying?
So we had here we're going to have had 10 observations. So we had 10 observations. Since one of you're always going to minus 1 degrees of freedom just off the bat, so now we have only 9 degrees of freedom. We ran a single variable regression.
So those, if I can, those observations are n.
Yep.
Okay, so then for the residual, the sum of squares is n minus 2, is that right?
For residual, no, so the total degrees of freedom is going to be n minus 1. That's how we get the total. Here's n minus 1. This is equivalent to the number of variables in our regression.
Okay.
So if we switch this to if we had a multiple regression with 2 variables, this would become 2. And then residual is equal to n minus the number of variables in the regression minus 1.
N minus k minus 1.
N minus k minus 1. Yep.
Okay.
Matt, would you be so kind and open the formulas for me?
Okay, one second.
Distribution.
There we go. Okay, here's the formulas. But the more important thing to remember is that when we do our p-value, because we're given a t-stat, the first thing to remember is to select the t-statistic that we calculated, and then residual for our degrees of freedom. So here it says write the regression to the right. The regression to the right, we would say usage, does it tell us what we're estimating? Y. Might just be Y.
Everybody's way.
We're going to say Y is equal to 6.1092 plus 0.8951 times usage. That's our regression.
Can you actually answer the t-stat from p-value and go right back into it?
Yeah,
Inverse?
if inverse. So you'd be using,
Because he might give us a p-value and no standard error.
you'd have to use T dot inverse two-tail, comma, your degrees of freedom is going to give you the same value there.
So you still need a degree of freedom.
Yep.
Because he might blank.
For T distributions, you're always going to need the degrees of freedom. Unless you get over like 10,000 or something. I think that's somewhere it's a number. Yep.
What was the formula used for that?
T dot inverse dot two-tail. Remember with inverse equations, that's when we're given a probability value and we want an actual T value or T stat. That's when we use inverse. So using the ANOVA table, compute the coefficient of determination R squared. Okay. R squared is going to be equal to our sum of squares regression divided by our sum of squares total. So in your book has SSR for sum of squares regression and then SSE for sum of squares error. So where it says residual in your output for Excel, your book refers to that as error, just for nomenclature's sake, so we can do it. So what is our R squared? Well, R squared is going to be our sum of squares regression divided by our sum of squares total. Our R squared is 0.819. Comment below on the strength of relationship of between dependent and independent variables. Well, first, we see that usage has a statistically significant effect on our Y variable. So the first thing we always want to do when we're interpreting the impact is the impact statistically significant? In this case, yes, it is. So we're going to go from there, and we're going to see that our R squared value is 0.819, which means that usage in this regression is explaining about 82% of the variation in our Y variable. So for a simple linear regression, explaining about 82% of the variation is a pretty strong relationship. So we can say that, one, usage has a statistically significant effect on Y because our p-value is going to be less than any alpha we can come up with. It's going to be less than 0.01 or 0.05 or 0.1. And number two, our R squared tells us that 82% of the variation in Y is explained by usage.
Because coefficient is greater than 0, it's a positive.
Yeah, it also has a positive impact. You can talk about that. You can talk about a positive impact. You could even say a 1 unit increase in usage causes a 0.8951 unit increase in Y, but without the units of Y, it's a little hard to interpret it that way. But any questions on that? Yep.
So the relationship is based on the Y, not the X, right? It's based on the usage.
I'm not really sure what you mean.
You're saying that based on the p-value and R squared, the usage, it shows the statistical effect that usage has?
So it shows that usage has a statistically significant effect on Y.
Because of the p-values on it.
Because of the p-value. So the one when we run a regression, we're always kind of assuming that our X variables are affecting our Y variables. So since the p-value is less than our alpha, then X usage has a statistically significant effect on Y. And I'm not sure what Y is as specified within this question.
But when it's talking about, so then the R squared talks about the relationship or no?
R squared talks about the amount of variance that we explain within the regression.
So when I say the relationship between the variables is strong because the R squared accounts for 81% of the variance?
I would say that using the regression with just usage, we account for 82% of the variance within Y. So we want that to be higher. The more of the variance we can account for, we can explain, the more accurate our predictive model is going to be. Any other questions with C, B, before C? Okay, C. Out-of-state tuition and fees at top graduate schools of business can be very expensive, but starting salaries and bonuses paid to graduates from many of the schools can be substantial. Following data show that out-of-state tuition and fees can average, and the average starting salary and bonus pay to recent graduates rounded to the nearest $1,000 for a sample of 20 graduate schools of business. Okay. Build a scatter plot in the right, in the cells to the right with salary and bonus as the dependent variable. So we're going to select here. We can highlight the whole thing. We say insert a scatter plot. But we want salary and bonus to be our dependent variable, which it already did that for us, so lucky yes. Well, let's say it didn't, and we wanted to switch that up. We could switch rows and columns. So now, that's not the way to do it. We can go here, we can say edit, and we can specify which variable we want to be X and which variable we want to be Y.
If you cancel out half for a second, if you click on your graph again, sorry. See how the green box? Can you just move the green box?
I mean, no. You have to go, I mean, that would only change the label though. That's just the label they're provided here. So we can really just, what's happening here is when we select data, undo what I just did. When we select data, that green box is just this first series name.
Thank you.
So if we wanted to switch it up, what we do is we come here, we'd say edit. We go to our X values. We say for X values, instead of tuition, we want salary. And for Y values, instead of salary, we want tuition. And now they're switched up. That's the easiest way to kind of go about that. So trend line, regression equation, coefficient determination for your chart. We can all do these without actually running the regression. We can go to layout. We can say add a trend line. We can say more trend line options. We can add in our display our R-squared, and we can display our equation on the chart. Pull those two to the side so we can read them a little better. There we go. It's the quickest way to do that is by doing it just within the chart. Since we're only doing a simple linear regression, it's going to be the same as doing the full regression analysis. The only difference is here we can't tell if these variables are statistically significant or not. So using the data analysis regression tool, test for significance of the relationship between independent and dependent variables at a 5% significance level. So now they want us to test whether or not the relationship is significant. So we have to run the regression. We can do data analysis, regression. Our Y variable is salary and bonus. That is our dependent variable. Our independent variable is tuition and fees. Can someone explain to me why that's the case? Why is tuition our independent variable and salary our dependent variable?
Because that's what it said in the question.
Trying to predict the
Partly
salary.
correct. We're trying to predict is the main reason. So we're trying to assume a causal relationship. So it's much more difficult to assume a causal relationship when your future salary is predicting what your current tuition is going to be. It doesn't really make that much sense, and it's not really a useful regression if it does make sense. What makes sense is we're assuming that if you're paying more money in tuition, you must be going to a higher end program. You must be getting some sort of value for that more expensive program that you're going to. So at a significance level of 0.05,
You could also say, I want to make 150,000 by that how many years I have to be in school, or how much tuition. That's just backwards.
that's how going to law school. So your significance F for a simple linear regression is going to be equivalent to your p-value. Since we're running just, what your significance F is in multiple regression is saying, are any of these variables significant? Is more or less the question we're asking ourselves. So if we're asking ourselves, are any of these variables significant? And this is what we get for a significant F. It should be equivalent to a p-value, and it always will be. So with an alpha value of 0.05, we see that tuition has a statistically significant effect on starting salary and bonus. And we can also interpret that. We can say that a $1,000 increase in tuition causes a $1,915 increase in starting salary or bonus on average, holding all else equal. Second part says, does the estimated regression provide a good fit? For goodness of fit for regressions, we can always look at our R-squared or our adjusted R-squared. They're at about 73-ish, 72-ish. So a single variable tuition explains 74% of the variation in starting salaries. So for a simple linear regression, that's a pretty good metric. Yep.
Can you repeat what you're saying? $1,000 in tuition.
Okay. Yep. So the way we're assuming this to work is that if someone paid $1,000 more in tuition, the beta value is 1.915, but it's in thousands. So we'd assume that a $1,000 increase in tuition would cause a $1,915 increase in starting salary and bonus, on average, holding all else equal.
So if we would have had this equation before we started this program, if we were making more than $114,000, we probably should
You're making a lot of assumptions, but okay.
Could you repeat that once again? So $1,000 more in tuition? Like
So
would
remember,
have a change in
we said a unit increase in X
the unit.
causes a beta increase in Y. So we look at the units Tuition's units is thousands of dollars.
On that.
So a 1 unit increase in tuition is a $1,000 increase in tuition, causes a $1,915 increase in your starting salary and bonus. This is why it's always important to know what units we're operating in, so we don't improperly
Calculate.
interpret this.
So $1,000 in tuition doesn't gain us $1.92.
Yeah, that would be really bad if $1,000 in tuition only gave us $1.92 in starting salary, but it gives us a $1,900.
ROE would be measured in centuries.
So, assuming a school has an out-of-state tuition of $43,000, predict the starting salary or bonus for a graduate to your intercept plus your beta value times 43. And then we can take this entire equation. We multiply that by 1,000. So if you went to if you paid out-of-state tuition for a business school and it costs $43,000, then your starting salary and bonus should be $116,152.
Can you go back to the equation?
Yep. So the equation is going to be the intercept plus the beta value times 43. Because remember, our units are in thousands, so 43,000 is 43. And then we times that whole function by $1,000 in order to convert it into units and dollars instead of using units and thousands of dollars.
And so that intercept is not $33. It's
33,000. Yeah.
So the 43 comes from the 43,000 in the question, correct?
Yep.
Yep.
Is that where?
Mhm.
Okay, and then we multiply it. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. So according to the regression output, what is the value for beta null? The value for beta null is 33.7879. If we want to do that in dollars, it's $33,788.
You say how we want it.
Yeah, either one. Both of them are proper and correct. As long as you label it in units though. So if you don't multiply it by 1,000, it's $33,787,000. And for beta, the beta 1 value is either going to be $1.915 thousand or $1,915,000. Or $19,115.
Hold on. So beta null is intercept
Yep.
And
Beta
beta
null is
1
intercept.
is beta value, correct? 1.91.
Yeah, so remember this equation here? We had beta 1 and beta null. Beta null is always going to be our intercept of our equation. Intercept meaning that if our x is equal to 0, if all x is equal to 0, what would y equal? So if someone paid $0, in this case, someone paid $0 in tuition, what would their starting salary be? For this example, it'd be $33,000. That's your intercept. That's your beta null. Beta 1 in your regression equation is multiplied by x1. So beta 1 is going to be your tuition and fees, saying that for every $1,000 increase in tuition and fees, we're going to see this $1,915 increase in your starting salary.
Okay.
Questions on tab C?
Does the estimated regression equation provide a good
Bless you. So what you do there is you look at your R squared. So R squared value. R squared value is here is about 74.74. So basically what we're saying is, one, tuition does have a significant effect on salary and bonus. And we're saying a regression with just tuition as an explainer explains 74% of the variation in starting bonus and salaries. So it's a pretty good explanatory variable for a single variable. If we took everyone's salary in this room, and we were able to find one variable and explain 74% of the variation of all our salaries, that'd be pretty good. single variable estimator. I don't want that variable estimator in my research. Other questions?
So when you're saying, does it provide a good fit? You look at, there's no outliers, or you just say because the.
You look at the R-squared value, and it's just for simple linear regressions, you talk about how much of the variation it explains. And for simple linear regressions, if you're explaining anywhere over 50% of the variation, that's going to be a good fit for it. Because it's very, in reality, no one's really using simple linear regression models. So anything over 0.5, he might have given you a different specification, but these are all way over 0.5, so these are good fits. But kind of the main point, though, is interpreting, you know what R squared means. So we know that R squared tells us how much of the variation in our dependent variable we're able to explain. We're able to explain through our regression.
So basically, there's 74%.
Yep. So out of all the variation in these salaries, we're able to account for 74% of it. So we're saying the other 26% is just kind of air at this point we can't control for.
That's so too.
So let's go to the book. The book will help us out. There's a question in the book and it explains it better. Did you guys like already try to do this problem and ask him about it? Because on Saturday he was like, they're having a hard time with it. And I was like, well, didn't they just get their homework?
Yeah, I think a couple people did.
Okay. Case problem 1 is in the back. Here we go. Case problem 1. So measuring stock market risk. One measure of stock market risk volatility of an individual stock is the standard deviation of the total return, capital appreciation plus dividends over several time periods. Although the standard deviation is easily to compute, it does not take into account the extent to which the price of a given stock varies as a function of a standard market index, such as S&P 500. Okay. 698. As a result, many financial analysts prefer to use another measure of risk referred to as beta. So we're measuring risk in the stock market, and we're measuring risk, and what we're using is our beta value for a stock. The beta value is going to give us a measure of risk, but it's in response to market conditions. So that means how much of a change do we find in a stock over time relative to the entire stock market. So if we look at our values that we're given, our values are given as percent returns, month over month percent returns, and we're given it for Microsoft, Exxon, Caterpillar, J&J, McDonald's, SanDisk, Qualcomm, Procter & Gamble, and the S&P 500 overall. So first thing to do here is we want to know what our mean return or our average return over time is. So for the sake of brevity, I'll just do Microsoft. You guys can do it at home. Fun for you guys. So Microsoft, mean return for Microsoft over time, month over month return is 0.005 over this time period. So we know that every month Microsoft is gaining 50 basis points, which seems pretty good. In 6 months, they're going to gain 3% over. In a year they're going to gain 6%. So that's a pretty good return on your money. What's our standard deviation? How much variance is Microsoft seeing over time? We'll do the standard deviation of a sample. So over time, Microsoft standard deviation is 0.0454. That's pretty big relative to the mean return. So we want to know our beta value. So like I said, a beta value is a measure of risk in response to stock market conditions. So Microsoft's returns, we want to know how Microsoft's returns are affected by total market conditions. So Microsoft is going to be our dependent variable in this regression. Our Y variable, yep. And so Microsoft is going to be equal to some beta value plus beta 1 times whole market returns. And what value do we have on here that's a measure of the whole market?
S&P 500.
The S&P 500. So X1 is going to be equal to S&P 500 returns. So we're saying, given how the whole market performed over time, how did the whole market's performance affect Microsoft's performance? So that's going to be a regression. Yep. That's not good. There we go. We're going to put it right here. We're going to data. Actually, what we can even do is we can put them into their own, each one into their own sheet. So we go Y is our SP 500. That's our, Y is Microsoft. That's our dependent variable. Our independent variable is the S&P 500. Labels, confidence value, output range, new worksheet. We'll call this Microsoft. So boom, we can kick out our regression results into a new worksheet. So if we continue to reading in our book, it says betas for individual stocks, similar regression, and what is the part we're interpreting? The value for beta in the stock market will always be 1. So if we estimate S&P 500 on S&P 500, that value would always be 1. And our beta null value is going to be 0. So what we're saying is, as the whole stock market is 100% responsive to itself, if your beta value for a stock is above 1, that means you have a stock that has more variance than the market as a whole. If your beta value is below 1, that means you have a stock with less variance than the market as a whole. So with Microsoft and our beta value being 0.458, if the market swings up 10%, then Microsoft is only going to swing up 4.5%. So they're going to have a smaller growth in the market. So they're moving with the market, but they're just not as responsive as the market as a whole. But that's kind of the downside of a big stock like Microsoft. On the upside,
That's 45%.
yeah, so I said 10, but if the market goes up 10%, then Microsoft's going to go up 4.5%. So on the upside is, say the market goes down 20%, then we can assume that Microsoft is only going to go down 9%. So there's less variance in Microsoft's movements relative to the whole stock market. So it's kind of a more,
Stable.
we'd say, stable, secure type stock.
Not even still or security, just not as related to.
Yeah, not as variable as the S&P 500. Then we can go here and we can look at, let's predict what's one that would be kind of up and down?
Caterpillar, Sandisk.
SanDisk? Okay, we'll do SanDisk. That one's probably pretty steady, I imagine. So, what is our dependent variable? Our dependent variable is the return from SanDisk. We're going to output this to a new tab. We're going to call that tab SanDisk. So, SanDisk beta value is 2.6. So, SanDisk has a lot more variance than the stock market as a whole. Or when the stock market changes, SanDisk is far more volatile in its response to changes in overall market conditions. So for this, we're going to go through and do each and every one of these companies. Which stock is the most volatile? Someone just said SanDisk, so it's probably SanDisk. Comment on how much of return for the individual stocks is explained by the market. So we can go look at these two. So our R squared, 0.07 for Microsoft, 0.12 for SanDisk. So we're only explaining 7% of the variation in Microsoft when we control for market conditions. So very little of the variation in Microsoft's stock performance is explained by market conditions. For SanDisk, we're explaining 12% of the variation in SanDisk. So one thing we're kind of seeing here is if you have a higher beta or you're a more responsive stock to market conditions, then market conditions are probably explaining more of your value than stocks that are less responsive. So since we think of Microsoft as more of a stable stock over time, market conditions play a smaller factor in Microsoft stock value than market conditions play in SanDisk's stock value. Yep.
Can you just compare beta and R squared, just so I understand?
Is there any significance to the intercepted?
For this one, no. A lot of times you're going to say we're going to ignore. So beta and R squared.
Yeah, like when we're interpreting these,
Mhm.
I understand what beta is, but in comparison to R squared.
R squared gives us the amount of, out of the full regression, how much of the variation in our dependent variable we explain.
Mhm.
So out of this regression, how much of the variation in SanDisk's stock price is explained by the S&P 500? And then the beta value says, if the S&P 500, so this is kind of an imaginary question. Actually, let's turn it down to 10% instead of 100%. So it's 2.6 the beta value. If S&P 500 goes up by 1%, then the price of then the return on SanDisk is going to go up by 2.6%. So that's the responsiveness. So beta is always a unit change in X causes a unit change in Y. So it's just showing us that SanDisk is that much more responsive to change than, and our Microsoft example, if a 1% change occurred in the stock market overall and in the economy, Microsoft would only respond with a 0.45% for that 1% growth in the overall market. But obviously, there's some other drivers behind Microsoft's stock price that we are not accounting for here. So if the S&P 500 had a 1% increase, Microsoft's stock price would increase by 0.45% on average, holding all else equal. Questions?
So-
in like units, on what you just said, rather than percentage. So like,
Your percentage is kind of in units because you're doing a month-over-month increase in stock price. So
You could just call it dollars if you wanted to, but that's not good.
yeah, it's not the units. You always have to interpret in the units you're given. So it's not really a dollar for dollar increase
because
because
another example that we need dollars, like the tuition.
yeah, we can use dollars there. So it's always important to know what units your question is in, which I'll give you guys that. This is not like a super, this isn't the greatest explanation of what units your measures from. Let's go find it in the book. Yep.
Sorry, just on the R squared for Microsoft,
Mhm.
it's just so my mind is like super low. So the way that you explained it, you said if you have a more responsive stock to market conditions,
So there's two things with that. So first thing is it is super low. So if we were just trying to predict Microsoft's month-to-month return using the S&P 500's month-to-month return, it's not a very good measure. It's not a very good regression.
R squared is telling us.
I mean, it might be a good measure to include with a bunch of other measures, but by itself, standalone, is not very good. Relative, but when we look at how responsive Microsoft is to the S&P 500 versus how responsive SanDisk was, it makes sense to us that SanDisk, we're getting a better explanation of what's going on with SanDisk. So SanDisk is more sensitive to market conditions than Microsoft is.
So, and that tells us that that's so low.
Yep. And it tells us because this is low relative to how SanDisk is low, and we know that it's more responsive when we look at the beta value.
Speaking of beta value, if we think in terms of y and x, which one would represent y's value and which one would be? Is it the beta value intercept? Correct? No.
So Y is going to be this particular company's
Companies. Okay.
return, and X is the S&P 500. And so beta is beta X, so beta 1
Yes.
for X.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
That's bad. All these are going to be not very good.
But SanDisk is 12%.
Still low, but it makes sense that it's better since we said that SanDisk is more responsive. So basically what we're essentially doing with the S&P 500, we're saying this is changes in the overall economy. This is a proxy for changes in the overall economy. So we're saying that Microsoft doesn't care that the stock price of Microsoft people don't value it as it's not as responsive to overall economic changes, because even if the economy goes down slightly, Microsoft still has value. Microsoft still has to sell their services. People still want their services. SanDisk, on the other hand, had a much, much higher beta, which means that the price of SanDisk stock probably ebbs and flows with the full overall economy a lot more than Microsoft does. So we expect the overall how the economy is performing to be a lot bigger explanatory variable for SanDisk.
Then on the J&J, it was 0 for data and 0 for
Yep.
R squared.
Yep. So I'm not going to say it's going to hold for sure for all of them, but the logical stream makes sense. If you're more responsive to market conditions, and market conditions are going to explain more of the variation in your stock price.
There was a couple of
A little bit off.
that were lower than SanDisk that had higher R squared. But that's what he said.
Okay. Questions on these? These are just kind of plug and chug, so you can do the rest of them at home, but we got the general gist. Okay, I'm gonna go take a break. I'm back.
So tell me about your trip.
Which one?
The one that you're going this weekend.
Oh, this for you? Oh, we just take an RV down there and go stay at the racetrack. We'll get down there tomorrow.
Where is it?
In Phoenix.
It's gonna be cold. No? Is that area?
A little bit warmer than here, but
Oh, that's-
yeah, at night it gets cool. Yeah.
Are you excited?
Yeah, we've gone every year for the last 5 or 6 years, something like that.
That's awesome.
It's fun. It's here. If we go here, the RV park is on the inside of the racetrack. In Phoenix, it's outside the racetrack, but still, you're out there with all the other RV people over there, and so that's fun.
How cold is that? So when are you leaving? Thursday? Friday?
Tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow
Oh,
after work.
tomorrow. I hope you have a good time.
I know.
It got a little. The weather should be great, but we had secured an RV 4 or 5 months ago, and it was just like one of those RV share things. You know, somebody's got an RV, they posted it there and says, "We'll take it." put the money down on everything. We've been trying to get a hold of them. So you can find, what's in your RV? You got a coffee pot. Do we need to bring a coffee pot? Things like that,
Right,
you know?
right.
This morning, we finally got a hold of them. Now, we've been planning this trip for 6 or 9
Don't tell
months.
me
RV's broke,
they refunded.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah. But now, here we are Tuesday, we're leaving tomorrow, and we don't have an RV. The spot's paid for, the tickets are paid for, everything's paid for. So it's been a mad scramble today, but we found one.
Are
The
they
stuff we're about-
expensive? Are they?
It was about $1,000 for the what did they threw, for almost a week. But it's me and another couple, so the 4 of us go down, it's not bad. It's significantly less than staying in a hotel down there. Plus you don't have the nightmare of going on, to finding parking every day and all that sort of stuff. You can just chill. You can bring, make some sandwiches and then walk to the track and gotta.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a blast.
Good for you.
I've done it a couple times out at the Las Vegas Speedway too. It's very fun. If you're into that, it's very fun.
Yeah, no, definitely. So are you guys going to do anything extra besides that? Like some.
No, we go there and park and we're there for 4 days. Yeah. So they always have, there's always a lot of vendors there and selling stuff and things like that. And they'll have, they had Dodge was out there and they were having, I think it's when the Charger and the Challenger were new that year. They would have, you could go in one with a professional driver and they would just take you around and do drifting for a while. And so one year, Toyota was down there and they had like an obstacle course they set up. They had a big mud pit and huge logs and huge rocks and a hill. So you could go test drive a Toyota Tundra showing you how tough their truck is, right? Well, we got down there on Thursday. I don't think we left Wednesday. I think we left Thursday, early Thursday. So we were down there by early afternoon, and I had plenty of tequila that night. Friday, we got up and we're walking around, going to visiting all the vendors and stuff like that. I'm going, this looks fun. Let's go do this Toyota Tundra thing. Well, they make you take a breathalyzer first. At noon, the next day, I was still legally drunk. So I didn't get to go. And I haven't done that since, but Toyota hasn't been back, so I never got to do it. Yeah, so I try not to do that much anymore. Yeah, we don't have any viewers right now, but yeah, it's on the internet, so it's going to be there forever now.
Yeah. How fun. I need to do more traveling. I have been doing a lot of working. That sounds like fun.
So I'm bringing my homework with me. This other guy. It's going to drive down there and it's
Well,
about
but there's not much left after today as far as homework. I mean,
For this.
study.
but I still got the pre-planning for 2 cases, or at least my share of it.
Well, if you need anything, let me know.
Well, we've been working on that, like, I saw your comments on the Amanda project. I went
Oh,
through
yeah?
I made some comments on there for roadblocks, because Vince put up the background, and you put up the stuff in the badlands and stuff like that. So I got the roadblocks. I threw up my thoughts on roadblocks, and that's great when anybody can just go jump on there and do it. Then you can add comments on the side. And
Yeah, I
really
didn't
good.
want to touch people's stuff, so I just started with that comment.
Well, I don't think that's your final document. I think that it works good if people just throw their comments in there and then put a comment on the side. This is, that background thing, and then we'll take that, we'll merge it into a more formal document.
Yeah. I added the bananas, but because Vince had the chunk of that, so then I added a few bananas, but I don't know if I put a remark that it was mine. But
Good
yeah.
to go. Ready to go? Okay.
Okay, so DC World rated component characteristics
I don't want to go
for 10 ultra portable laptop computers. including performance and features. Each characteristic was rated between 10 and 100-point scale. Overall rating was developed for each laptop. So we have a rating for performance, a rating for features, and then an overall rating for each laptop. Use multiple regressions predict the dependent variable overall rating. That's going to be our Y variable. Using the independent variables, performance and features. So I've already done that right here. The key for us is when we have more than one X variables, they have to be next to each other in Excel. If they're not next to each other in Excel, it's not going to be a fun time. So,
You think he'll mess with us and this?
Yes.
I mean, probably not. Maybe, who knows? He seems like a nice guy.
Yeah,
All the homework.
The only time I could think that could possibly happen is if you have to make dummy variables. When you make dummy variables, you have to make your own variables. Those have to be next to each other. So you might do some.
Tepsi.
Yeah, and that's gonna be a
Might be doing some monkeying around there, but other than that, probably not too much monkeying around. Does the test reveal significant relationship between the dependent variable and the set of independent variables? Remember before we did a simple linear regression, and I said that our p-value of our ANOVA test is going to be equivalent to the p-value of our beta value.
Mhm.
That was because we had one variable. Now we're running a different test. The new test we're running when we do a multiple regression is we're essentially setting up a hypothesis test that says if our null value, our hypothesis, or null hypothesis is that beta 1 is equal to beta 2 is equal to 0. An alternative hypothesis here is that our null hypothesis does not hold. So if either beta 1 or beta 2 are not equal to 0, then our overall p-value from our ANOVA test for this regression should be lower than our alpha value. So it gives us an alpha value of 0.05, and we can scroll on down and look at what our significant F is. Significance F is 0.0017. So it's going to be less than our alpha value of 0.05. So what we can say is we know that this regression overall does have a significant effect on Y. These two variables together have some form of a significant effect on Y. But do we know if they both have a significant effect? Do we know if one of them has a significant effect? That's going to be the second part of the question. So the p-value is just going to be the significant F. It's the p-value. So the second part says, do performance and features reveal significant relationships? Why does it reveal? Do performance and features have independently significant relationships with overall rating? So we want to say, hey, we know both of them have some form of relationship on overall rating. Now, do each of them have a significant relationship? For performance, our p-value is 0.0214. That's below our alpha value, 0.005. So that's good. For features, our p-value is 0.01007, and that's below a p-value of 0.05. So they both have a statistically significant effect on overall score. If our alpha value was 0.02, then we could say, then we would have a 0.02. We'd have a case where our overall regression was significant, but one of our two variables was not significant. That can happen. That's something to be wary of. In this case, they're both significant.
Is there any importance to the intercepts line on this?
No. Sometimes intercepts don't make sense. That's going to be the key for simple linear regression. So since we're starting a simple linear regression, the line has to start somewhere. So we're essentially saying that given all this data, if we had a 0 score on performance and a 0 score on features, so if I mailed in
a cardboard box to PC World and they rated it, they would give me a 40-point score on my computer. So sometimes the intercept makes sense, sometimes it does not make sense. So we usually don't interpret the intercept, especially when we're doing multiple regression. Say we're trying to control for everything we control for and predict someone's wage. So we can control for their age, education, experience, any sort of skills or trainings they have. Well, then your intercept's going to be someone who was newly born with no experience and no schooling. So sometimes the intercept doesn't make any sense. And this time it doesn't.
So it's basically just there for our wife.
It's there so we can graph it out. It's an arbitrary starting point. It's not really arbitrary, but it's a starting point on the y-axis where we start our line.
Starting at 0, that would make sense. You're starting.
Yep. You're starting at a point where, and it kind of represents some form of unexplained variance that we can't really control for right now in this equation.
So see when we saw the simple regression or the with beta value, like if this changes the unit, then the variable changes.
Yep, and why?
So here, since we have two
We have two x
independent
variables.
variables, would they both be moving at the same rate, or this would be
They're moving
independent
at
from
their
each other?
beta values. But remember at the end of this interpretation where we said on average, all else equal,
Uh-huh.
we're controlling, our all else equal means we're controlling for performance and features. So we're saying if we were to increase the performance score on a PC by 1 point, but that PC had the same feature score, then the overall score would increase by 0.1133 on average, holding everything else equal.
But those two values would, like for example, would double or triple equally, or would
No.
be no
Nope. They're independent.
independent
These
from
performance
other.
is independent of features.
Okay.
So whenever we interpret the performance beta value, we do it assuming that we've held features constant. So our features don't change. What if we increased our performance with the exact same features? So it says here, what would you predict for a laptop with an overall performance rating of 86? First, we're going to do our intercept plus performance times 86 plus features times 84. We expect an overall rating of 0.81, or 81.82. So remember, that's our intercept plus performance times 86 plus features times 84 gives us our predicted output value of 81. So it doesn't ask you in this question, but we can kind of talk about this a little bit more. A 1 point increase in performance causes a 0.11 increase in overall score, holding everything else equal, holding features equal. So if we increase performance but our features exactly the same by 1 point, our overall score is going to go up by 0.11. If we held performance the same and we added 1 point worth of features, whatever that means is kind of arbitrary, but we increased features but held performance exact same, a 1 point increase in features is going to increase the overall score by 0.38. So clearly from this regression, we see that features have a larger impact on our score than performance. So if we're a computer company, we're kind of stuck, and we can either increase our performance by a little bit, or we can increase our features by a little bit. Given this score, if we're trying to maximize our overall score, features is kind of the way to go in this scenario. That's not really asked for in the question, but it's good to get practice on that kind of stuff. So Condé Nast.
So can I ask you a question? So when you say all this, how does it translate to like an everyday language? Like, is it more features? Is it?
Well, yeah. So features has a greater impact on overall score. So if we think that overall score is going to make us a better laptop, or we think a higher overall score leads to more sales,
then it's easier to increase our overall score by increasing our features than it is by increasing our performance.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Condé Nast rated 20 small cruise ships. The following data show the scores each ship received based on the results from the magazine's annual Reader's Choice survey. Conduct a regression analysis to determine if the overall rating can be predicted by schedule, shore excursions, and food and dining. So, we're trying to see what causes changes in the overall score, overall rating for a cruise ship. Obviously, the thing that is changing, the thing that's being impacted, our dependent variable is going to be overall score. Our inputs are going to be schedule, score excursions, and food and dining. I'll put rating, say H2. There is our regression. So, does the significance F test hold for the full regression? Is the full regression significant? Do all three of these, do at least one of these three variables have a significant impact on our Y variable? Yes, it's very, very small significant F. We know that this regression is truly measuring a statistically significant impact on Y. Once we get into multiple regressions, though, that's going to be the case all the time unless we're running a regression that doesn't make any sense. So, which independent variables are significant at an alpha value of 0.05? So, we can look at our p-values. Schedule is the only p-value that is above 0.05. So, shore excursions and food and dining both have statistically significant impacts on overall score. Apparently, schedule does not have a statistically significant impact on overall score. Next question says, rerun the regression removing any independent variables that are not significant. So here, we're going to say data regression. Regression, we'll throw it into H25, and that gives enough room. And then we're not going to include B any. I'm not going to include C anymore, so we'll start at D. So now we'll go here. We're only highlighting these two variables. We're excluding schedule. Boom. So comment below on why the R squared value decreased in second regression while the adjusted R squared slightly increased. So R squared before was 0.7498. Our R squared after was 0.7384. The reason, and then our adjusted R squared decreased, actually increased when we drop that variable. So our R squared is going to be the measure of variation. So the more variables we pump in, the more independent variables we pump in, the more we're going to inflate our R squared. Our adjusted R squared takes an adjustment for the number of variables we're including in within our regression, and it does not allow us to artificially inflate our R squared value by pumping in non-significant variables. So that's why once we get into multiple regressions, it becomes more important to look at our adjusted R squared instead of our actual R squared.
So the R squared is more satisfied with quantity, where the adjusted R squared is more satisfied with quality.
Yes. And it's not that it's more satisfied. It can be easily tricked by pumping in more and more variables. And sometimes, this is kind of not for this class, but sometimes we have to include these control variables that are not statistically significant. So we're just pumping in a bunch of variables we kind of need to put in there because it wouldn't make sense if we included some of them but not others. And so adjusted R squared becomes more and more important because it's given truly effective variables and measuring the impact on Y, how much of that variation are we expecting?
Does it have anything to do with degrees of freedom?
Yes, it does. Let's look at the adjusted R squared formula.
Because there was 16, there were 3 regression degrees of freedom in the first, and then only 2 in the second. But the total is still the same because it's the same number of observations. So,
Have 1 second.
I don't know the math is right. So you understand what you're saying, quality versus quantity. But there's math to do too, right?
Yep.
Well, you have to fill it out in the next question. So, oh, you're Googling it?
Yeah, I can't find it. Here we go. Yeah, so adjusted R squared. Normally, we're just taking for R squared, we're just taking our sum of squares regression divided by sum of squares total. When we do our adjusted R squared, we're putting in this metric on top that involves the degrees of freedom as a corrective measure to not get overinflated in our sum of squares. Because the more variables we plug in, the more sum of squares regression is going to go up automatically. But our sum of squares total is going to remain constant. Okay. And it's just this corrective measure here where we're taking 1 minus our R squared times n minus 1 divided by n minus p minus 1. So a corrective measure that includes the number of predictors we're using and our overall number of observations. Boom, so okay, there we go. C, consider the repair time data set. Is independent variable months since last service? What? Predictive repair time. Okay. Why are these words so weird? We're going to be doing indicator variables here. So the first thing to do is to move these variables to the side because we can't put words into a regression. Excel will not like that. They'll get very upset with us. So can we get to establish in here? It's going to say if electrical is repair type, then 1. So we're going to call this variable electrical. And we're going to say equals if electrical, if type is equal to electrical, comma 1, then 1. If not, then 0. We can drag that down. So every time we see electrical, every time we see electrical, our electrical variable will be equal to 1. The next one is Dave or Bob, and they want Dave to be equal to 1, so we're going to call this one, let's call him Dave. So we can just drag this over here. And now, anytime person column says Dave Newton, then 1. If not, then 0. And we can drag that variable down. And now we've created indicator variables for both electrical and Dave. Okay. So is independent variable months since last repair predictive of repair time at an alpha value of 0.05? So first thing they want us to do is just do a simple linear regression. Our dependent variable is repair time. Our independent variable is months since last repair. Pop that out. We're going to see that our significance F is 0.016. Alpha value of 0.05 is going to be significant. So months since last repair is a significant, has a significant impact on repair time.
Based on the p-value?
Based on the p-value for the overall regression and the p-value for the beta value for the months. So this and this. How do we interpret that? If we increase, if it's
if we increase the months since last repair, or since last service, by 1, so we increase the months since last service by 1, repair time is going to increase by 0.3 hours.
Mhm.
So 0.3 hours is probably 18 minutes or so. Okay, so next says rerun the regression and include a dummy variable for type of repair. And we already created a dummy variable for electrical. So we're going to say data regression. Move this down to H22. And our dependent variable stays the same. Our independent variable becomes months since last repair and whether or not the repair was electrical. Or whether or not the repair issue is electrical. We run the regression. Our overall regression is significant. We look at our p-values. Our p-values for electrical is significant at 0.005. So let's interpret the beta value for electrical. Since electrical is a dummy variable or a binary variable, it's only 1, 0. So either repair is electrical or it is not electrical. So if a repair is electrical, the repair time is going to increase by 1.26 hours, so 1.25 hours. So what we're saying is, when we compare electrical and mechanical problems, electrical problems are going to take 75 minutes, 1.25 hours or so, longer to repair than mechanical problems. So holding the months since last repair constant, electrical problems take a lot longer to fix than mechanical problems do. Yep.
Why do we change it to electrical and not type?
Because now this variable does not represent type. This variable represents whether or not the repair was electrical. So we could do the same thing for mechanical instead of electrical. We can't include them in the same regression we're doing there, but say we did mechanical instead of electrical. Then the beta value for mechanical would be negative. Because comparing electrical with mechanical, electrical takes longer to repair. So if you're a mechanical repair instead of electrical, it's going to take you less time to repair. And next it says, including the regression person. So we use Dave as our indicator. Yep.
Is the p-value significant? Yeah.
For this one?
Yes.
No, they each have their own p-values here.
It says, what's the p-value for the second regression?
So the second regression is significant stuff. It's really once you put full regression. One wrong. So now they want us to do also repairman. We'll throw that into H44. Our independent variables are going to increase. We're going to add a third independent variable of Dave. Output our regression. So
is Dave significant?
So the overall regression is significant. Is Dave significant? P-value is 0.167. So what we're saying is there is no statistically significant difference in repair time between Dave and not Dave guy. So is knowing the repairman important in repair time? We would answer no. There's no statistically significant effect of repairman on repair time. So Dave and Bob, I believe the guys, they both work at about the same speed. So what's more important is whether or not the repair is electrical or mechanical, and whether or not and how long it's been since the whatever we're fixing has been serviced. I assume a car of some sort.
So the first one was a simple regression, is that what you did? And then multiple, and now you change it to electrical, months, and day. Correct?
Yep, so we ran one single and two multiple regressions. And in the final regression, we found that Dave, indicator variable for Dave was not significant.
Yep, so before you move on to D, can you explain the adjusted R squared again? So I understand the multiple R and R squared, but what did you say on that tab D?
So adjusted R squared, we have is an R squared metric that has a corrective measure for including too many predictive variables that do not give good explanatory power. So if we were to push in more and more predictive variables, even if they were not significant, our R squared, by the nature of the calculation, is going to go up. So what we essentially do is we put in this corrective measure, and here's the equation for it. We put in this corrective measure that kind of controls for that problem by putting more weight on the predictability and punishing you for adding in more predictors if they don't give you proper predictive power.
So it's a higher score. Good or bad?
Higher score is good for adjusted R squared. For both of them, R squared and adjusted R squared, we want that score to be higher. But the reason why when we start doing multiple regression, we start focusing on adjusted instead of regular R squared is because we have a tendency to kind of put in variables that might not give us very much.
So when you look at the multiples, I thought you looked at multiple when you had predictive variables. Multiple. So doesn't that take out the variables that are bad?
Now, multiple R is a different calculation.
So adjusted R squared accounts for variables that may not make any sense.
Yeah.
Multiple R, what is the significance of multiple R?
I had to read up on it. I don't use multiple R very much. I mean, some people probably use it for some sort of metric, but I think it's
R squared. It's the
it's
square root
the
of R.
square root of R.
It's the square root of R squared.
Yeah.
That's basically it. Never mind.
Okay, so tab D. We're supposed to. If you guys go to, let me see what page it is. There's a bunch of these formulas in a row, I think. 727 gives you your template for your ANOVA table.
727?
727 for our multiple regression. So, starting here, we're given an R squared. First things first, let's solve the easiest portion of all this. Is going to be, what is our t-stats? T-stats is going to be our coefficients divided by our standard errors. We got all three t-stats. So, we're given our R squared, and if you look on page 720, we know that R squared is equal to our sum of squares regression divided by our sum of squares total. So if we're given our R squared and we're given our sum of squares regression, we can figure out by logic how to solve that. So we're going to take our R squared value, which is 0.4762, is equal to 6179.1 divided by x. X is going to be a sum of squares total. We're going to multiply this whole equation by x. I would do by x. That's better. That's better than my idea. I think it's not going to be very fun. X times 0.4762 is equal to 6179.1. Then we're going to multiply this whole equation by 0.4762. So x is going to be equal to what?
Yes.
Yeah, divide, yeah. Same difference. So our sum of squares total is going to be equal to our sum of squares regression divided by our R squared. So we get that. Our sum of squares total is going to be equal to our sum of squares regression divided by our R squared. Good? Okay. So our sum of squares residual is going to be the difference between our sum of squares total and our sum of squares regression. That's easy. And then from here, we can also figure out our multiple R, which is going to be the square roots. Our square roots of our R squared value.
Can you stay on the formula so I can see that, please? Square root of B.
So if we look on page 727, we're given our sum of squares residual. And so our sum of squares residual is going to be equal to, or our sum of squares error is going to equal to our total number of observations minus our number of predictors minus 1. We see here in our regression output that we have 2 predictors, which means our degrees of freedom regression is going to be equal to 2. And our degrees of free total is going to be equal to 31. And if our degrees of freedom total is equal to 31, then our total observations is going to be equal to 32.
How did you get 2?
Okay, so 2 comes from this. We have 2 x variables.
Oh, so you inside, okay. Gotcha.
And then if you look at page 727, so the degrees of freedom for regression is equal to the number of predictors. We have 2 predictors. And then the degrees of freedom for error is equal to n, the number of observations, minus p, the number of predictors, minus 1. So we're given our degrees of freedom residual, which is 29. So if we have predictors being equal to 2, and then also minus 1, that means our total number of observations would have to be 32. And then our total degrees of freedom is equal to our number of observations minus 1.
And is observation always your total degrees of freedom plus 1?
Yep. Questions on that one again?
So on a data set, for example, we would have 30 observations, meaning rows, correct?
32.
And then we would
32
have,
rows.
okay, 32. And then we have 3 variables, correct?
Yep, we have 3 columns. We have 1 y and 2 x's. Yep.
Thank you.
This is a 3 by 32 matrix of data. So the next thing that we can do that's pretty easy now is we can calculate our p-values. Remember, for our p-values, it's always going to be a t-distribution, 2 tails of our t-statistic, and then our degrees of freedom of our residual.
We have the same thing. Is it because the t-statistic is negative?
Yeah, it's t-statistic.
T-statistic can be negative. Yep, that's okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, it just doesn't like it because I locked the cell.
I do, I
I got. Did we do t-stat right up there? Was that what you got for t-stat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Well, your t-stat's going to be negative because your coefficient is negative and your standard error is negative. So your t-stat's always going to be negative if your coefficient is negative. Your standard error is always going to be positive. So we can do those. We can just take the absolute value.
Okay.
And it gives us a p-value there.
So
That's what he showed in class.
Yeah.
We did that. Thank you.
Yeah, if x equals 0, then it returns the num error value.
That's weird. I don't know. I'm used to like looking up in the back of the book on the actual t-distribution chart. It
Mhm.
would be negative on there, so. Okay, so now we've completed our entire regression table. So the next thing to complete is going to be our ANOVA table. Remember that our mean squared is always going to be our sum of squares divided by our degrees of freedom. Our sum squared divided by our degrees of freedom. Our F is our mean squared of regression divided by our mean squares of error or residual. And significant F is going to be F dot distribution right tail of our F value, first degrees of freedom, second degrees of freedom. There we go. Yep. F distribution right tail of your F value is the first thing you select, and then you select your first degrees of freedom, and then you select your second degrees of freedom.
Yeah. we get that. So you just have to do the adjusted R squared formula.
Yep.
And would you be so kind and show F formula as well, Matt?
It's in your book on page 727.
727. Yes.
So.
Yep.
I got the same formula with a different answer.
Or I'm using here.
Does it matter if you put
B15 first and then B16 second.
Oh, so that'll mess it up.
Yep.
Wow.
Okay, so our adjusted R squared formula, as we see here, I'm going to write up in big letters. 1 minus 1 minus R squared times n minus 1. All that divided by n minus p minus 1.
Is that a time then minus 1?
Yep.
N is observations.
N is your observations.
P is
Number of predictors.
P is predictors.
your regression degrees of freedom.
Yep. So your independent variables.
Close enough to get this. And everything else, so then you just have to go from there.
Yep. So it's going to be a big convoluted formula. We're going to pay really close attention to what we're typing. So here we go. Is equal to 1. Start with your 1 minus, open up a parentheses for the full division of the equation. Open up a second parentheses, open up a third parentheses. 1 minus R squared, close that parentheses, times number of observations, minus 1, close that parentheses, close the top parentheses. So now we've done the whole numerator of this equation. Divided by, open up another parentheses, number of observations, minus, we can do regression degrees of freedom for 2. It's probably easiest, and then you have a formula that's repeatable. Minus 1. Close that parentheses, close the overall parentheses, and there's your equation.
Bada boom, bada bing.
You're missing a parentheses.
Yeah, that's.
Probably missing a parentheses somewhere in there. So remember, open up with 3.
You both been parentheses certified.
He never taught us this, just so you know. I'm just going to say that. Just throwing that out there.
I think it's in the.
Oh.
That's where Jack got.
So what's the, no, she needs to look at that.
0.4401.
So Matt, some of these formulas, I'm trying to follow you, but I get lost. On the book says, for example, MSE, but technically it would be MS residual, correct? So what would be the easiest way for me to?
Just remember that we have regression, and then, I mean, it's probably best to go by the book and then just change your outputs in Excel. So whenever you get your output, just change it from residual to error. Or you just have to memorize that there's regression and then there's something else. And if it's not regression, it's either error or residual. Okay. Tab E is similar to tab D. Let's do something real quick here. Let's go to tab D. Let's go, and we're going to take our adjusted R-square. We're going to hit copy. We're going to tab E, and we're just going to paste that just as a formula. It's going to be blank for now. You'll thank me later. So,
What did we just do?
we copied over the adjusted R-squared. Here, copy this. And we paste in the adjusted R-squared there. This is the formula. First thing we can look at is degrees of freedom. We have 2 predictors. So we have 2 predictors. That means our regression degrees of freedom is going to be equal to 2. And if our regression degrees of freedom is equal to 2 and our total degrees of freedom is equal to 9, that means our residual degrees of freedom is going to be equal to 7. If our total degrees of freedom is equal to 9, then our observations, our total number of observations is going to be 10. So that was good and fun. We got that out of the way. So then we can look at our sum of squares. If our total sum of squares is given and our regression sum of squares is given, then our residual sum of squares or our error sum of squares is total minus regression. From there, we can calculate our mean of squares. For both regression and residual, and then we can calculate our F value. We can go back to tab D, and we can copy over our formula to figure out our significance F. We can paste it there as a formula, and it'll give us our significant F. There we go. Things are going pretty good. Now we can figure out all of our t-stats. And we can figure out all of our p-values. T-dot distribution, two-tail. This is our t-value. This is residual degrees of freedom is what we use. We can mark that. We can pull that down.
sure what the standard error formula is. Oh, it's that one.
So. If, now we have to figure out what our R squared is gonna be equal to. This is gonna be fun. Oh yeah, it's gonna be equal to, yeah, well, yeah. That was much better than I was gonna do. I was gonna solve it through the R squared adjusted.
Take that, Greg.
Square root of the R squared will give us our multiple R. Oh, how do you get standard error? You guys know?
681. Please kind of find something here.
Max,
Mhm.
could it be square root of the mean squared residual?
Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think, yeah,
Sure.
I don't know, is that right?
Let's try it. Square root of our mean square residual to give us this. Let's check it on here. If we do the square roots of our mean square residual. Yeah, that's it. Yay!
So, would you be so kind of show all the formulas now? Thank you, ma'am.
That's gonna be a test question.
Yes. Good.
Hey, Mac, did you put the answers back up? So
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, I will be here tomorrow.
What are we going over?
Probably the same type stuff. So if you guys don't want to be, if you guys aren't here, then fine, I'll be here anyways. Might be a shorter session. And then next week we'll have 2 days of test prep. So I'll send out all the reviews I sent out again, and I'll send out a list of example questions that we'll be going over, one for each question type. And then we'll just kind of address, like, given a question, read through it, what's that question asking, which template or Excel program are we going to be using to solve that question, and then how to interpret those questions in general.
Okay.
Any other questions for the evening?
ICFE,
No.
and then the adjusters. Okay. Yeah.
Be very careful when you do big division type formulas in Excel. You get messed up pretty quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, man.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Was it out of focus all the way?
No, I was watching it earlier, it was. There we go. No, I checked on the periodically and it was. I think it was just from looking in front of it. Okay, I'm trying to